Wes Burke, Chief People Officer at Care.com. We've got a few people still coming into the room, so I'll just give it another minute before we get started. But really excited to share some content with you. Okay, we will go ahead and get started. So before we jump in, we do have one quick question or poll on your screen. We'd love your input. Also for today's session, feel free to submit questions at any time using the chat. We are going to leave some time at the end of our webinar to address any questions that you have. But feel free now to fill out the poll. Okay, looks like responses in. Okay, so we're excited to share with you our 2026 Future of Benefits Report and talk about what it takes to build a workplace culture of care. This is a report that we've been publishing for 6 years now, and this year's findings are based on insights from 600 benefit decision makers and about 1,000 employees. As I've reviewed the report personally, I can tell you one call out for me is the major shift in how caregiving is reshaping the workforce and specifically redefining what HR leaders need to prioritize in terms of their benefit offering. I'm joined today by two great voices on this topic. The first is Sherry Snelling, corporate gerontologist and CEO of the Caregiving Club. She brings deep expertise on caregiving trends and the changing workforce. We're also lucky to have John Simon join us. He leads our care benefits at Care.com offering. In his role, he works closely with employers to evolve their benefit strategies and help them understand the new world of modern benefits. Really excited to have both of you here, Sherry and John, and look forward to an interesting conversation with you. So caregiving has traditionally been seen as something employees deal with outside of work, but what we're seeing both in our research and in conversations with employers is that this shows up in the workplace in a very real way. In fact, 81% of employees report moderate to high caregiving related, sorry, employees report moderate to high caregiving related stress, which proves this is not just a niche issue. This is a workforce level issue, and it impacts productivity, retention, and the overall well-being of our organizations. And I think in many ways we underestimate the impact day to day. To really understand what's happening and why it's accelerating, I wanted to bring in Sherry. Sherry, you've spent years studying caregiving trends and how they reshape the workforce. What are you seeing in terms of your direct experience?
Yes, thank you for having me, Wes. This is such a great topic, and I'm so excited to see the new results that you guys have from this year's survey that you've done. We've been seeing a change in the workforce now for the last few years, and I think it's undeniable that at any given stage of your career or your lifespan, as we call it, you could be in a caregiving situation. We know that we have parents who plan to be parents, but we don't often plan to become a caregiver for our older loved ones, whether that's a parent, an in-law, a grandparent. And then in between, we may also be caring for, a sibling who is neurodivergent or a spouse who has, recently received a certain diagnosis. So there's a lot of ways that we walk into this role of caregiver when we're also juggling our work responsibilities. And as you see from your results of this year's survey, we know that the majority of employees out there are in caregiving roles. 74%, as you see, millennials are caring for at least one child. We also know that more than half are caring for two generations. We call them the sandwich generation because you've got kids that you still have responsibilities for, but now all of a sudden you've also got, again, those older parents or maybe in-laws that you're caring for. What I think is really challenging for today's HR departments and workplaces is the lack of self-identity when it comes to saying, I'm a caregiver. So a lot of the communication that gets done is around this caregiving theme, but how many people are really resonating with that? And one of the things that I've seen over the years is that you have to have kind of a consistent cadence in your communication to your employees because today, I may not be a parent, but 9 months from today, I could be a parent. Or today, I'm not caring for an older loved one, but all of a sudden there's a crisis event. And in 2 or 3 months, all of a sudden I'm in the middle of the storm and I'm looking for good resources. I'm looking for help. I need a place to turn to. So making sure that you're constantly reminding employees that you've got certain benefits, you've got certain supports that can help them, I think is a really critical thing that we see. And I think also just sharing longevity statistics. I can share a few with you here, but I've always found that when I do educational webinars, people are always fascinated by the longevity statistics out there. So, for instance, we do know that we could have possibly 4 to 7 generations alive at the same time in one family. We know that 24% of 60-year-old women will live to the age of 100. We know that the oldest millennials will turn 50 in just 4 years. And we also know that 50% of 15-year-olds have a life expectancy of 104 with potential to live to 124. Now, as you absorb those numbers, all of a sudden it becomes very obvious what we're dealing with in the workplace. We've got longer lives. And what that means is maybe we might have longer careers, but also we're going to have these older loved ones that we're going to need to take care of. So, there's no one size fits all to caregiving, which is, I think, another good thing that we have to bring forward in communication, in that there's a lot of different things that we have to think about. And the journey for caregivers is not a sprint, it's a marathon. The average is about 4.5 years. If you're caring for someone with dementia, it's double that. It's about 9 years for your caregiving journey. So I know we're on to the next slide. I'll just move forward here with some other comments. One of the things I talked about in my second book was this concept of Gen Z, or generation caregiver. And really what that does is it kind of takes away the demographics of being a millennial or a Gen Z or a boomer or whomever. You are still going to be maybe part of generation caregiver. And how do we look at that? How do we understand that? So I mentioned earlier that um, you know, often caregivers don't self identify. So the more that we can help them understand that they're part of a very large volunteer long term care army in this country of 63 million Americans who are now in a role of caring for a loved one is pretty significant. And we also want to, talk about. How do we look at these life stages and give you the right supports, whether you're parenting, whether you're in the middle of your career and all of a sudden you've got a crisis? How do you manage through that? And one of the things I think is very tough for caregivers of all stripes, colors, and stages, or whatever, is that we don't know what we don't know. And I think this is where employers can play such a critical role of just helping to educate people about the types of resources that are out there. A lot of caregivers say, in fact, the majority of them say, I feel all alone. And as you see, they're not alone. There's 63 million caregivers out there, but you kind of become the default primary caregiver in your family just because of family dynamics. Sometimes it's geography, you live close or whatever. And that feeling of being alone, I think, also starts to add to the stress that you saw in your survey. It starts to add to some of the mental health issues that we see. So, trying to help caregivers feel supported and know that they're not alone, and helping to guide them in the things that we know they need help with, I think becomes really critical, and a great role for employers who are looking to, again, recruit and retain some of the valuable caregivers that are really out there. Just as a comment, Japan is a super ager country. And so we know that there are far many more older people that need care and not enough younger family members to care for them. We're starting to see that now in the US. In fact, by 2032, for the first time in American history, we will have more people over 65 than children under 18 to care for. So we are starting to see some of these shifts. I think it's one of the reasons why Japan has been really at the forefront of a lot of the technology and the robotics and things that we see out there. But again, I think it's something that we need to take a look at holistically. What do our families look like? What do we need from our workplaces in terms of those supports? And for very many of the working caregivers out there, they want to maintain their jobs. The difficult dilemma is, do I need to step away from my job to take on now this caregiving responsibility I didn't really plan for, particularly with an older parent? And what we want to do is give you options and give you that balance back so you can make the right decisions for you.
Sherry, by the way, I think that phenomenon that you just described, especially for anybody who's got an international workforce, is happening in the US and Europe, where it's a little bit disconnected is in Asia, right? Where you have a little bit more balance of workforce, with Japan being the exception. So really like a global issue as we move forward.
Yes, definitely a global issue. And as you said, some countries have better supports and better systems, and we can certainly learn, I think, from some of those best practices that are out there. I know, for instance, the UK, but particularly Scotland, has a lot of really wonderful programs to support caregivers who are working caregivers, but also their older population. From a kind of more of a economic perspective, the one thing that we do know is that this care economy, as we call it, is huge. The World Economic Forum had actually said that it's the number one fastest growing economy, even faster than something like the green economy that we see out there. There was another report that was done that said that the care economy represents a $648 billion economy or opportunity, which is why we see a lot of entrepreneurs and startup companies starting, particularly in the tech field, get into this. But it really kind of also underscores how important care is to society, to businesses, to all of us, to really recognize the role of those 63 million Americans, which will only grow over time. And again, how do we adapt? How do we adjust to make sure that we're supporting them in the right ways? Very often, I think we talk about the maybe loss of productivity, because we do know that caregivers, they get called away to crisis moment, have to run to the ER or take someone to a doctor's appointment all of a sudden, or a child is sick, and do you have somebody that can step in for you? All those types of things that come up in modern day lives. And I think that one of the things that we miss is, can we, as a collective, and particularly in the workplace, can we also flip the script a little bit? Because I saw some recent study that was done that was separate from your future benefit study, but it's really interesting, and it was all about how there are certain skill sets that caregivers are learning that become so vital to the workplace. And when we talk about that, the study found that caregivers have 78% of the skills that that we are looking for as employers. And so it's things like the ability to multitask, the ability to collaborate, the ability to have patience, have that more emotional intelligence, the ability to navigate things that are a little bit more difficult. All of these things are really great skills. And so I really would hope that employers could look at, how do we help with the productivity, keeping these valuable employees in place and on the team, but also how can we champion the types of skills that they're learning when they become caregivers, particularly if they want to re-enter the workforce, or their careers, if they've stepped away for whether it's a few weeks or however long of time. But I think that's really interesting, and I think it's something to explore that really becomes part of what you found too in your survey in terms of the value of caregivers in the workplace. And then finally, we know, again, as I said, we've got multiple generations who are at work. And a lot of people think, well, the majority of people who become quote unquote caregivers, particularly I think when we talk about older loved ones, are going to be more in that Gen Z. We know Gen Z is the demographic, if you will, that is the largest part of the sandwich generation. They have children as well as older parents to care for. But we also know that there are very young caregivers out there in the Gen Z population who are in their 20s, who might have a grandparent with Alzheimer's, and they are playing a role in their caregiving. And we also know that there are people who are older in the workplace, who are in their 60s, and they may have an 80 or 90-year-old parent, or they may have a spouse who is now encountering certain chronic illnesses or whatever. So again, there's no one size fits all. caregiving is a constant. You think if there's any message from today and from what your survey shows, it's that caregiving is a constant across all of your employees and at whatever different life stage or different point they're at in their lifespan. And so I think it's really important for us to help, guide those caregivers on how do we help you with your life balance? Because one of the things we know is when you're not planning, and we often don't plan for the senior care, elder care part of this equation. So we go into it in a crisis. That creates the stress because we don't know what we need to know. All of a sudden, everything is just piled upon you, and you start to lose yourself a little bit. So I know one of the messages that I've been trying to bring forward over the last 20 years when it comes to caregiving is how do we help caregivers maintain that balance and not lose themselves, not drop the ball that says me, practice the self-care, even if it's for 3 minutes. And I will say that applause to the Care.com team because you guys have started to bring those types of things together with the partnership, for instance, that you recently did with Headspace to do the meditation specifically for caregivers. Those are the types of things I think that are really beneficial for employees to see that they're valued and they're recognized by their employers.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. And just one thing I'd call out as a people leader and an HR leader, we're already dealing with so many factors of multi-generational in the workforce, and this is just one that's like often overlooked. And so I appreciate you calling attention to it. I would call out, I saw an interesting piece of data from BCG a couple of weeks ago that talked about caregiving benefits in the workplace, particularly around the frontline workers that you sort of alluded to. And when you think about this being the bulk of the workforce in America today, in the US today, only less than 10% of companies actually offer benefits, caregiving benefits or family care benefits, and for that population. And these truly are the people that we need to show up to do a job each and every day. And it's in our critical infrastructure, it's our service industry, et cetera. So I think this creates even more tension sort of in the economy and stability of who we are. So I really appreciate it. Go ahead.
No, and thank you for I forgot to mention that in that very often when we talk about some of these surveys, and again, one of the things I think that was so great that you guys did is it's not just the 9 to 5 office worker, right? It is the retail, the workers, the shift workers, the hourly workers. We know that, over 80 million people are hourly workers. We also know that 21 million people are shift workers, and they have very different, as you said, very different responsibilities and very different needs as caregivers because they don't have the ability to just say, I can't go today or whatever to work today. So, yeah, we have to take a look at all of those different dimensions of caregiving and how it affects your workplace and start to craft what are the best benefits to support those particular workers. That's a great comment.
Yeah, thanks, Sherry. And so as we look at this next slide and talk about this, like this is where we do start to see disparity and where things break down. And in particular in our report, I think that we found that employers recognize that caregiving is an issue. But I completely think they're underestimating the scale of the issue. And so there is a gap here between perception and reality, between what employees perceive is happening and what employees are actually feeling in terms of the pinch. When you think about this, only 1 in 5 employees truly feel supported, and less than a third feel like their managers are actually prepared to help. And that could be through a level of, variety of different things, empowerment, institutional support, et cetera. But there is certainly a gap there. So, even though companies are trying and sort of edging toward this and thinking about how do we offer more support, it just doesn't translate into real life help and the support that's needed. And that gap has consequences. Nearly half of employees have reported decreased productivity. More than half have missed work due to caregiving challenges. So this becomes not just an employee experience, but it has a huge operational impact on how we operate our businesses every day. And it shows up in things like performance, attendance, and engagement. John, I'll hand it over to you to talk through the business risk.
Yeah, thanks, Wes. And you're right. This is really where it becomes a business issue. Wes, you've used the phrase before that this isn't a living room conversation; it becomes a boardroom conversation, and that's really true. We're seeing that nearly a quarter of employees have considered leaving the workforce entirely because of care needs, and many more are willing to change employers if a new employer were to offer better support. In 2025, just as one example. A study showed that 3% of women with young children left the workforce, which was the largest drop in 40 years. kind of one of those inverse statistics. There are now more male caregivers in the workforce than women. And that has to do more with, well, with two things. Number one, there's greater emphasis on identification, but there's also been a shift in terms of employment. And I think kind of stepping ahead, of real importance, we mentioned this a couple of times already, but stress. Stress is a major underpinning of so many things. Caregiving is the number two reported driver of stress for employees, number one being financial. We can certainly understand that caregiving also encompasses financial stress. So really, the top two categories are really related to caregiving, given the cost of care, and the stress of caregiving itself. Again, stress is a major underpinning of medical care. So really, as we think about it, anything that can be done to solve upstream can go a long way towards improving organizational health at the macro level. And really, the statistics that you're looking at here represent the cost of doing nothing. And I'm just going to add real quickly, just in relation to a comment in the panel. So the statistics that we're showing today are from our 2026 Future of Benefits report that we just released yesterday. As Wes said at the top of the call, this is the sixth year that we've conducted this study. We surveyed both employers and employees to derive this information. So if we move then ahead, the flip side, right? So the cost of doing nothing are some of those statistics. The flip side is that this also creates a real opportunity for employers. More and more employers are starting to invest in family care benefits, and they're seeing it as a way that they can differentiate in a tight labor market and also gain really strong, valuable returns. It's moving, I would say, from a nice to have benefit to something that's becoming more and more expected from employees and from potential employees. Organizations that are getting ahead of this are having and will continue to have a real advantage in both attracting and retaining talent in the short and the long term. And a key finding that I want to call attention to is really it's this awareness gap. And I would say, in all my years in employee benefits, this awareness gap exists across the benefits ecosystem. This is not unique to child care and senior care. We studied it specifically within our survey because much like many other components of an employee's benefit offering, we can see that while there's many companies that already are offering caregiving benefits, there's a lot of employees that don't know that they exist. So the issue isn't always the investment, but it's the visibility of it. If employees aren't using the benefits, you're not getting the return. So, just something to keep in mind that much like so many other components of a benefit program, it's about communication as well and ensuring that you're getting the return that you would expect by ensuring that there's visibility to what's being offered.
Yeah, I mean, when one comment on that, John, not necessarily the awareness part, but it is interesting to me. I've been at Care.com for 3 years now. 6 years we've done this survey. 3 years ago, I don't know that care benefits, family care benefits, were showing up in the top 10 requested, and now we're seeing this sort of significant movement and shift as we think about the real issues that are impacting our workforce today. And so, my prediction is that this is going to become louder and louder. The cost of care, which is a whole other topic of conversation that we can have, continues to burden families. I think it's 37% of household incomes now go to some sort of care need. And as a result of that, employees are turning to their employers to look for some level of help, which, brings me to this. Like, what does this mean in terms of how we drive impact as HR leaders or benefit leaders in this space? And one of the things that we looked at is the types of support that drive the most impact. And so what we found is pretty clear. Benefits like backup care. And when I say backup care, this is defined as usually when the primary sort of caregiver that you use either inside of the home or outside of the home is unavailable. Like, how do you prepare for those emergencies? And then things like access to or discounts on childcare centers. This is like at the top of the list, right? And in many cases too, like if you're in a major metro area that has limited supply, like is there a partnership with the employer to get priority in terms of getting into that daycare center? So these both have real impact on terms of productivity, but I think more importantly around attraction and retention. Like how do you get the right level of candidate that you want today and retain them? And the reality is our workforce demographics are shifting or skewing older. So you tend to see more working parents or second generation in today. So how do we make sure that we're tailoring an offering that really drives and retains? This is where employees and employers are aligned. Like we see commonality in the future benefits report that these things really matter. And that common thread of support reduces the financial burden of care and provides flexibility by meeting employees where they are, but also providing some level of stability for work or for employers to make sure that they retain their top talent. So up until this point, we've talked about what's changing and where the gaps are, but we haven't really got into what this looks like in practice. And so I'm going to pivot here and ask a couple of questions to both Sherry and John, really understanding like what matters most. And so Sherry, I'd like to start with you. What does it mean to what does it really mean to recognize caregiving as a workforce reality today, in general?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And I think, again, as we're seeing, the statistics show 1 in 5 employees, are caring for an older parent, 1 in 3 are caring for children. You guys have the latest statistics from this survey as well, saying 74% of millennials, have at least one child at home. So it's really recognizing again that lifespan caregiving. It's not just at one stage, it's not just being a parent, it's not just being a spouse, it's not just being someone who's caring for an older loved one. It's kind of across your work life. You're going to possibly step into these different caregiving responsibilities. And how do we support you at these various stages throughout the journey in your career and also in, your family life and help you maintain that balance?
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you, Sherry. John, we just saw that these certain types of support consistently drive the most impact, but like, how are you seeing employers put these into practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe just building off of what Sherry shared, like many HR solutions, it's not something that is only necessarily addressed with an employee benefit. It's about matching a benefit with corporate policies and really importantly, company culture. And that's where employers really start to see the biggest shift. Um, and I'll just say, look, working caregivers are a really big cohort of employees. In many organizations, it's the largest. So as employers are solutioning around supporting their working caregivers, this has the potential to have a really broad impact. From a practical standpoint, I would say employers are evaluating and they're implementing caregiving benefits at a higher frequency than years past. And we're seeing that for a multitude of reasons. I think a lot of it has to do with awareness, as we and others have been in the forefront of really driving more and also seeing, as we've captured within our survey, employees coming forward with more of the challenges that they're facing in their efforts to be present both physically, mentally, and emotionally at work. So we're seeing employers respond by designing and deploying programs that help employees with really the three most pressing challenges that they face related to caregiving. And those are finding caregivers, affording care, and also navigating care. And this shows up differently within different organizations. We've talked a lot about frontline workers, and that's definitely an area where you can see very clearly, the impact of a shift worker, whether it's in healthcare or manufacturing. We've talked with a lot of employers, whether they've got first shift, second shift, third shift, recognizing the criticality of having people physically at work and providing with the tools and resources in order to do that. And really, it's just the awareness of recognizing that there are solutions out there, which is something that me and my team are talking about consistently. So, just seeing a broadening of this conversation, and we're excited to be at the forefront of it.
Yeah, I mean, John, you kind of alluded to this in your statement, and maybe I'll ask Sherry first and then pivot to you. It does then bring up the awareness gap. So like if we're talking about designing and employing a caregiving benefit, how do we think about in communication strategies to ensure that it's actually used? Because it's one thing to sort of offer it, it's another thing to get enrollment. And I think this is probably where companies often struggle the most once they get it in the door. So I'd love to hear maybe a comment from you, Sherry, and then pivot over to John as you spend a lot of time with employers on the same topic.
Yeah, I go back to kind of the comment that there is no one size fits all caregiving. And, John just alluded to the fact again that we're not just looking at workplaces that are 9 to 5. We do have a lot of manufacturing, we do have a lot of retail, we have a lot of other services where it could be hourly or shift workers or whatever. I've seen a lot of previous studies or research that's been done that shows that that care navigation piece becomes really highly regarded because if there is one thing that can help everybody, it's caregivers don't know what's out there to help them, whether it's saving cost, finding a service, modifying a loved one's home to make it safe, as you said, finding daycare, whatever it happens to be, having that resource that can help guide you and you don't have to do hours of research, I think becomes really critical. I think the other thing too is the awareness gap that John alluded to. I think again that goes back to recognizing this role of caregiving, not just doing a once a year thing. One of the things I think, and I've worked with you guys, Care.com, on a lot of the educational webinars that we bring to a lot of your employer clients. And one of the things that we started to do is not just talk about things that are related to maybe like senior care, but also how it relates to you. So, for instance, we do a webinar on Alzheimer's and dementia caregiving, how it can be different. What are the stages? What should you know? But then at the end, we also talk about your own brain health. What are some of the things that you can look at for your own self care, for your own life balance, for your own reducing your risk perhaps of dementia? So there's a lot of bringing those two pieces together. And I think when we can marry together the self care wellness piece with what's happening that we know where you're just overwhelmed with responsibilities, but let us help guide you, I think those can be very powerful.
And John?
Yeah, I think a lot of this, it ties back to me something that the CEO of a construction company once shared with a group. He equated caregiving to infrastructure, and his comment was, if there's a road that's under repair, or if there's a bridge that's out and it's preventing my employees from getting to work, we fix that road or we fix that bridge. And caregiving, in his explanation, was really the same thing. If an employee is unable to get to work or be at work because there's a breakdown in their care, their child's nanny is sick, their school is closed, a caregiver that's taking care of a senior loved one has an emergency that takes them away. That's a breakdown, and sort of his mindset is where we're able to, as an employer, step in and provide an employee with the resources to fill that gap so that they can come to work, is why this is of such critical nature. And something that we get asked a lot by HR teams is, how should we measure the value or the success of these programs? And I would say, so for a program like I just described, which is what we refer to as backup care, it's a really simple equation. Every day that an employee uses backup care is a day that they work instead of taking PTO. So that productivity measurement is really straightforward. But for other benefits, it could be looking at job satisfaction, employee engagement, other defined HR metrics that are already used today. A big one that employers are thinking a lot about that folds into an employee engagement is attrition, especially looking at key demographic categories of an employer's workforce. Caregiving benefits are one of many different tools that employers are leveraging to create that welcoming culture that encourages employees to bring their whole selves to work.
Yeah. One of the things too I would add to that, John, is that I think it's less than 12% of all employers do an annual care audit where they're actually surveying, like you guys are doing, but surveying within their organization, again, maybe the gaps between the benefit managers and the employees. But I think that becomes really important because not only does that survey consistently show, hey, we're aware of you, we value you, we want to know what your needs are, but you're also really starting to pinpoint on what what are those needs, getting closer to, what matters. I think the other thing too that I would just add is training for middle managers, supervisors, and even as far as the C-suite is probably really important to understand. If you haven't been through the caregiving experience personally, what does this mean? How does it affect you? How do we be empathetic and supportive? And then also really supporting those ERGs, those employee resource groups, which are focusing on parenting and the sandwich generation and caregiving. I'm doing a lot of talks now for those groups, and I think there's just a great appetite for having those types of groups that can also support each other. A lot of times we say caregivers are lonely, they feel alone, but not when they have others in the workplace that they know are going through the same thing that they can talk to. So I think that's really valuable as well.
It's interesting that you say that, Sherry, because I think in a pre-COVID world, and for my fellow care employees who are on the call today, I've not done this at Care.com, but in a previous world, pre-COVID, we used to do a benefits impact survey, and we'd actually ask people to assign a monetary value of each benefit to them. And the results would surprise me because I would think it would always really focus on like basic benefits like health. Again, this is a pre-COVID world, but like the flexibility and the ability to work from home is the number one rated thing. And at the time, our survey, I still remember this came back. Somebody said that's worth $20,000 a year to them. Like that they have the ability to have flexibility to pick up their kid, to drop their kid off, to work sort of into the night, or so they could be off in the middle of the day. So it's like things like that I think are super helpful to really understand how you frame these conversations up as an HR benefits leader with your management team to say, like, look, here's what we pay. Here's what people perceive the worth of these things are. Like, are they aligned or disconnected? So I really love the call out there. So thank you for that. For both of you, if we just zoom out for a second, what does like a true culture of care actually look like from your perspective, from what you've seen and the very many partnerships that you've had? And maybe Sherry, I'll start with you and then pivot over to John.
Sure. I think what's really important is to not just look at some of these things as a checklist of benefits. That's important, and that certainly has to be assessed. But I think when you have, people who are at the head or in senior leadership that talk about their own experiences in caregiving and they normalize it for other employees, they take away a little bit of that stigma. So the storytelling piece becomes really important. Again, having consistent communication that we're here to support you, whether it's through the ERGs or whether it's through other things that you can do, whether it's through the education, all of those types of things become really important. So I think that you have to really kind of walk the walk, talk the talk, if you will, as they say. And it's, to have a real caring company, you have to activate that every day. You have to show it, not just say it or not just have it on a checklist. It has to be things that are kind of really immersed throughout the organization in different ways.
Yeah, and I'll just double down on one thing that Sherry said in particular that really stands out to me, which is just going back and looking at that gap between employees that self-identify as being a caregiver and the data that shows how many people are actually caregivers, and that really speaks to the stigma of caregiving sometimes, and so the more that an employer can do to provide resources, to provide that safe space for conversation, to be anticipatory of needs, whether it's through benefits, through policy, or through culture, is really how we continue to normalize, again, this incredibly large cohort of employees.
Thanks,
Yeah, and,
John.
and I think you're right, John. I think the language matters, right? Just using words like, are you an adult child caring for an older parent instead of saying, are you a caregiver of an older parent, right? Or something like that. But using the language that really engages them, brings them in so they can see themselves in the types of things that are being discussed, I think is really critical.
I often say here with our team at Care.com that, we can tell from the dependent data from the medical plans that about 70% of the people here have dependents at home, assuming that those are, kid dependents. But the reality is I can say probably 99% of our employees are caring for a kid, a pet, a home, an adult family member, etc. So it's really hard to say that this doesn't impact every single person in some shape or form. Just to your point, Sherry, the care looks different. And knowing your demographics, I think, are really important as you tailor a solution.
Yeah. I think absolutely. I think it's, if there's one constant in our lives, it's caregiving. If you think about your lifespan, you start out being cared for. At the end of your life, you will have someone caring for you. And then in between, we're really creating all these relationships. You even mentioned pets. I saw a TV commercial when I was doing research for my book, and it was, you're a caregiver to your pet. So there's a lot of different ways we become caregivers. But I think as we go through those different life stages, care is always there. And I think that's the one message that I think is really important to understand is it never goes away. It might change or be a little different depending on the situation, but it's constant in our lives.
And I think on that note, this is a perfect quote to what you just described, Sherry. So, like when care breaks down, work breaks down, and it has a huge impact on how we think about productivity, retention, and performance. But like, take those a second. Those are the hard sort of things that we measure. It has a huge impact on the culture and the level of stress and your workforce. And I think as humans, we feed off the energy of others. And so if you're coming into a workplace that's stressed every day, like that is contagious. It shows up for everybody else. And it means that that shift worker who didn't show today because I have a childcare issue, the person next to them has to pick up the slack. And so this is a fundamental problem facing our workforce. And by the way, I think it's only going to get a little bit harder as we go forward, which does require a different level of intervention from employers than we've had today. So we're going to take questions, but before we do that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. If you'd like to go deeper into the Future of Benefits report, I'd encourage you to download it. You can scan the QR code here to access this. If you have more specific questions and you're interested in talking to somebody in our organization, we can absolutely reach out to you as well and have a one-on-one discussion. With that, there's a poll here that we'd love to get your feedback on the survey today, but I'm happy to open it up to questions from the group to see where we can start. And I think one of the first questions I've got in here is, what signals should HR teams look for that caregiving is already impacting retention? I'm happy to take this one and open up to the crowd, but I think there are sort of there's a leading indicator which generally shows up with absenteeism. Like you can immediately sort of see this in the workplace in various parts. And as a leader, like deep diving into that, understanding what's driving that is one thing. A lagging indicator is attrition. And I think one thing on attrition, because that's a very broad statement that we make, you can look in a few demographics to understand how the impact is. And I would start with your female population because it disproportionately impacts women more than it does men. I would look at your non-exempt or your entry-level roles because the cost of care is, in some cases, in some cities especially, it's so exorbitant that people end up staying home to take care of a family member. And then as a part of that too, looking at your exit sort of surveys. These are generally places I think I would start looking first. Again, the leading is that absenteeism, lagging is sort of that attrition rate, and specifically the demographic breakdown. Um, John, a question to you. If a company's just getting started, what's the first family care benefit that you would recommend prioritizing?
Yeah, great question. I would say, look, budget is an inescapable reality of the first-time caregiving benefits buyer. Even when we talk about something like backup care, where there's a very clear, cost benefit, return on investment. I like to say that, we say return on investment, but investment happens first. So really a lot of first-time employers are really first looking at offering unsubsidized support to their employees, meaning that the employer is providing a resource or a place for employers really to help with that finding caregivers, navigating caregivers, maybe a little less focus on the affording piece. The way we do that here at Care.com is we provide, or employers provide, subscriptions to their employees for a Care.com membership. Employees can then go find and hire their own caregivers. Might also, like I said, involve a care navigation resource. For us, that's our care specialist program. These are highly skilled and specialized counselors, including master's level social workers. They help employees with a wide array of caregiving challenges that they might be dealing with on a daily basis. We've said it before, I'll say it again. Caregiving is not the 5 to 9 that you do after your 9 to 5. So giving employees a resource that gives them time back during their workday that they would have otherwise spent researching care solutions is a major win. Um, and I'll also add here, with the caveat, we are not tax or legal advisors. Um, but companies should be evaluating the Internal Revenue Code Section 45F for available tax credits associated with providing caregiving support at the employer level. This was expanded last fall and included in the OBB Act of 2025. So I really encourage you to consult with your tax and legal advisors for the applicability of that. What the enhancements did was broaden the availability of credits in terms of the types of resources that are offered, and then also substantially increase the amount of those tax credits, again, under Internal Revenue Code Section 45F.
Thank you, John. Sherry, question for you. Like, why do you think so many employees don't actually identify as caregivers, even when they are?
It first of all stems from we have an existing relationship with this person. We're the adult son or daughter, we are the spouse, we are the parent. So we think to that first before we call ourselves caregivers. And then when we're in the workplace, we have certain responsibilities or titles in our workplace. So, when those two things come first, then labeling yourself as a caregiver is just something that we don't go to. But I think that the more that we can talk about this care across the lifespan, knowing that it's going to have different meaning and different needs that you have becomes really important for workplaces to constantly help remind the employees that we get that you're going to have maybe these added responsibilities as a parent, as someone taking care of an older loved one, and we're here to help you. I think that's the big thing because, again, caregivers don't want to hide, we don't want them hiding in the shadows. We don't want them not utilizing great resources or services that can help them. We want to recognize and champion this wonderful role that they're playing. Because let's face it, if we didn't have those 63 million family caregivers, the long-term care system not and the healthcare system would literally collapse. So they're really doing a hero's job, and I think we need to recognize that and provide the supports in the workplace that are, most meaningful, that employers can do is really important.
Yeah, I
I think
remember.
the other thing too that I would just like to kind of follow up on what John was saying is that some of those benefits are fantastic, the backup care, the navigation. I'm a huge fan of the care navigation. I also, because my mantra is the self-care wellness piece, I would love to see corporate wellness benefits, which are huge. We know those are so big for all employees, but put a caregiving lens on some of those things. Because let's just say if you're offering free yoga classes, well, frenzied, hairy family caregivers aren't going to be able to maybe take that yoga class, right? They're the ones who always get the short shrift on being able to tap into some of the wellness benefits. So again, some of the things like the meditations that you guys worked on with Headspace, look at how you can make sure that you're also thinking about the caregiver as the person you want to also care for, right? There's two people in the equation, the person they're caring for, but also them balancing their life and having that self-care piece. And I know that's a little bit more challenging probably for a lot of employers, but I think it's really important as we start to see wellness become such a huge, and particularly mental wellness become such a huge piece of this conversation around caregiving.
Yeah, I mean, Sherry, the thing, like the whole really normalizing workplace conversations around caregiving like resonates to me tremendously because I think all of us fear some sort of stigma, like consciously or unconsciously. And so creating like a space to talk about it, I think is super important. The example I would give is my mom like had a major accident like about a year ago, and I had to go down and take care of her. And I don't really think of myself as a caregiver in that regard because it's my mom and I'm just going to show up and do it. But I do worry how I'm perceived at work for not being at the office or missing meetings, etc. I think what helps me is like I have a couple coworkers who have caregiving needs on both sides. One I'm very close with who has a parent with Alzheimer's. And the fact that we sort of talk about that within our leader group, like meaning like within my peer group and with my boss, and there's support there, like it gives me a little bit of freedom to know that like going to do this is okay and it's accepted and it's a normal part of life. It happens each and every day to all of us. So I very much appreciate sort of that notion or thought that you have there. John, a question for you, and I think this might be our last question unless there's anything else that pops up. But has there been any research around employers of service industry or hourly professionals providing some type of workplace flexibility or financial support for care. Being that there's a reduction of service workers, wondering if these employers are seeing ROI or benefit to providing benefits to retain existing staff. And I know you talked a little bit about the construction example, but I'd love to know if there's anything more.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, there's different ways where this shows up in different cohorts of employees. Certainly while we want to have a culture of flexibility, that doesn't necessarily always work within the service industry or with hourly professionals. And so, that's more where employers are leaning in with tangible resources, tangible benefits. Again, something like backup care, where an employee has to choose between calling out of work or having a resource available so that their caregiving needs can be met and they're able to be at their shift. Or it's providing support through those care specialists to help somebody navigate a really challenging care situation. A 30-minute, 45-minute conversation with a care specialist to explain the issue that individual is faced with. And then that care specialist goes and does all of the research that employee would otherwise have to, candidly leave their shift in order to accomplish. If that research is needing to be done during their shift when, if they're evaluating a senior living situation for an aging loved one, a lot of that conversation, whether it's researching the types or the availability, or so many other things that go into it. A lot of that has to happen during the workday. And so for a care specialist to be doing that research while the employee is working, is that other tangible way. So, I would say again, there's always going to be sort of that corporate culture around normalizing this and creating that space. But also recognizing that flexibility might not always be the option in those more, service industry, hourly profession industries, shift industries, third shift even. And that's where a tangible benefit drives a really great return.
Yeah, and if I can just add to that, John, I was part of a pilot project that we did, and it was with hourly workers and shift workers, and we were researching what are their needs as caregivers, what makes the most important. And to echo what you just said, that care navigation, so that you get peace of mind that you're getting to a really good source that an expert has brought to you, but also they're doing a lot of the heavy lifting research that you don't have time to do. I think the second component that we saw that is kind of intuitive, but we don't think about is that employee had someone they could talk to who would listen to them and listen to their story and feel their emotions and help them. And I think there's so much value in that. We often think about just getting them to the resolution or getting them to the service they need, but also the help they get along the way. Just having someone to talk to is huge.
I'm sure. Okay, I think we're at a close. I first want to start by thanking all of you for joining us on the call today. And Sherry and John, such a pleasure connecting with you. This has been super insightful and energizing, I would say, for even me. So I appreciate everybody's time. Again, you can download our future benefits report. We're happy to connect with you on any additional questions that you have. But thanks for joining and enjoy the rest of your day and hope you have a great upcoming weekend. Thanks all.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.